So today we're steaming it up with Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I mean, it's basically like almost 2 hours of Elizabeth Taylor begging Paul Newman to sleep with her.
No.
You've got to.
I don't have to do anything I don't want to.
Which I don't advise women to chase men like that, but like, girl, I kind of get why. Hello, Starlets. I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I'm continuing my masculine, feminine energies, film examples, movie breakdown. Gotta come up with a better title for this because this is getting long to say. It's becoming a tongue twister. Anyway, today we're going to examine Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Yes, we're gonna steam it up. This is a classic film. It was based on a play originally and was adapted for the screen. And it stars probably one of the sexiest screen duos imaginable, Paul Newman and Elizabeth Taylor. One of the reasons why I wanted to examine this film is because it actually examines some very common but very dysfunctional patterns that people fall into in a relationship. Albeit, when they do it, it's way sexier and more glamorous and better looking than the average person, but we can still learn from it. So I have a lot of videos where I talk about what I mean by masculine and feminine energies. I will link those videos to this one, but just the basics. Masculine and feminine energies are energies that exist within all of us, but we all have a core energy. We are either masculine at our core or feminine at our core. That may connect with your gender. It very often does, but it doesn't always. But we can tap into the other energy at any time that we need to. It's just a matter of spending most of our time in our core energy because that's going to be our true self, and that's what's going to really fulfill us in life. And these energies can either be healthy or wounded in either gender. And this movie is actually a really great example of when they are wounded. So I'm going to start with Brick, played by Paul Newman. He is a... let's face it, Paul Newman's a very attractive man. If I were to... I don't have a lot of celebrity crushes, to be totally honest with you. Most celebrities kind of don't really do it for me, but there's something about Paul Newman, I gotta tell you. Even in this movie where he is like the antithesis of everything that I would want in a man.
Why can't you lose your good looks, Brick? Most drinking men lose theirs. Why can't you? I think you've even gotten better looking since you went on the bottle.
I'm still like, it's still Paul Newman, right?
Do you believe that, Goober?
Brick plays a former football star who's forced into retirement and then pretty much spends his time drinking and avoiding his wife. Brick is the quintessential wounded feminine male. That is basically a man who is in a very wounded place with his own inner feminine energy. Now, wounded feminine energy in males tends to come out, not always, but it tends to come out when a man is truly masculine at his core, but he has a really bad connection to his own feminine energy. And I have a video about wounded masculinity and femininity, which I'll link to this one. But wounded femininity, if you want to call it toxic femininity, whatever it is you want to call it, it tends to show up in very self-destructive ways. Very often it shows up in addictions that tend to be deteriorating as forms of self-harm, and that can show up in many, many different ways, whether it be alcohol addiction or whether it be overeating or any kind of like self-harming activities. Tends to show up a lot in lack of self-worth, insecurities, lack of boundaries, people-pleasing, things like that. We get a few different indications as to why Brick is sort of falling into this pattern throughout the film in little doses, but one thing is they reference a lot to a very close friend of his, Skipper, who passes away. Now, I believe it's been a long time since I've read the play itself. In the film, it's very subtle what his relationship actually was to Skipper. I believe in the play, it's alluded to a little bit more that it was potentially a homosexual relationship, even if it was never actually consummated, that there was some kind of a homosexual overtones to it. But that's not really specified in the film. It's just kind of skated over. So I'm not going to focus on that aspect of things too much. Although they do imply in the film that Skipper got very angry and aggressive at times, which implies, and again, we don't know much about his character, but it implies a toxic or wounded masculine trait in him. Masculine and feminine tend to attract. And so a wounded masculine and a wounded feminine are going to tend to attract, and usually not with very good results. Those are usually like really unhealthy, destructive relationships. So the fact that it's implied that Skipper had almost like a violent, angry streak, and that Brick has this very like self-destructive streak. I mean, whether or not they actually had a physical relationship, you could see where those two energies would attract each other. And Brick blames himself a lot for his friend Skipper's death, which we find out was a suicide. So that's one of the aspects to his drinking and his self-destructive behaviors, is this sort of self-blame and taking on all of the responsibility for somebody else's feelings or somebody else's choices. That's a very wounded feminine feeling and result.
Say it without a drink?
But I haven't heard that click yet, that mechanical click.
Boy, you need a lot of crutches, don't you? Clicks? Whiskey? What else you need? Skipper? He was a crutch for you too, wasn't he?
Yes, sir. He was someone for me to lean on, in school and out of it.
It's also referenced a lot in the film how Brick used to be this really incredible football star. He was a track athlete. He was this really incredible athlete, really put up on a pedestal. It was implied that he had offers where he could have played professional football anywhere. He ended up with a sports announcing job that he gave up. You get the impression that he had a lot of glory and a lot of success. And now he doesn't have that anymore. I believe they actually mention it in the film, but I know they allude to it, that he got injured and he had injuries and couldn't continue to play. Professional athletes, this is very common. They tend to have to retire young, but really any masculine core being, when they have to retire or have to give up something that they feel is their purpose, usually it's very easy for them to fall into a very wounded feminine, because masculine energy thrives on having a purpose. They thrive on having like a greater purpose and a reason for getting up every day. Albeit something like the glory of football or the glory of being a pro athlete, or the sort of the surface glory of those careers really is feeding the ego. It's not really feeding the soul. So because those things are so fleeting, they're not something that people really endure for a lifetime. When those things dry up, which they eventually do, if a masculine being doesn't either find a new purpose or have a greater purpose within them, it's so easy for them to fall into this sort of wounded feminine mentality of feeling sorry for themselves, of getting into things like addictions and things like that. Like, this is a really, really common thing that happens with a lot of men, and I think a lot of men in today's society, because I don't think that men aren't necessarily encouraged in our current society to truly find their passion and purpose for a lot of different reasons. I mean, we could get into it. I'm sure that there's many people who are going to talk about feminism and things like that. I'm not going to dig into all that in this video, because I'm going to do a future video on that, because I really have a lot of things to say about that topic. But in this video, I'm going to focus more on this particular situation. But this is just a really common phenomenon in today's society. You see it so many times with men who, they sit around, they maybe have substance abuse addictions, they just sit and watch video games all day. Like, they don't have a greater purpose for getting up in life. And we emphasize that more in women, and not to say that women don't need some kind of a passion and purpose in life, but masculine beings need a purpose. Like, they need a purpose in life, or they can't fully step into their masculine energy. It's also pretty clear that Brick has a really complicated relationship with his father. And I'm mostly going to focus on Brick and Maggie in this film, but clearly Brick's parents, Big Daddy and Big Mama, have a complicated, albeit traditional type relationship, one that is pretty common but doesn't appear all that healthy. Neither one of them really seems to be happy. Nobody's really talking about what they're really thinking. You get the impression that, again, it's an old school, very Southern, although this is not just a Southern family thing, but it's kind of like, oh, we don't talk about our problems, we keep everything suppressed. And you get the impression that part of Brick's issue is he's having trouble expressing emotions, which is very common in anybody, really. I mean, in today's society, we really dissuade anybody, but in this particular case, men, from expressing any kind of emotions. And that's going to build up. And also part of the problem with men being constantly told to suppress their emotions, which telling men to suppress their emotions is really telling them to suppress their feminine energy. When you suppress your feminine energy, it tends to become wounded, which leads to a lot of the problems that he has in this film. Whereas in many cases, if he had been able to openly discuss his frustration from not finding a purpose, his mourning his friend's death, if he was really able to fully express that, he may have actually had an easier time coping with it in the long run. And I think that's also why he gets very uncomfortable when his wife, who we're going to get to in a minute, when she expresses her emotions and her feelings, he resents it. It bothers him and it repulses him. Why? Because he wants to be able to express his emotions. He wants to be able to show that, but he doesn't know how, because he hasn't really had a role model or encouragement or a safe space to feel like he can express his emotions. It's also really interesting. There is a scene where Brick and Big Daddy are arguing, and Big Daddy references the fact that Brick never grew up.
You and Skipper and millions like you living in a kid's world. Playing games, touchdowns, no worries, no responsibilities. Life ain't no damn football game. Life ain't just a bunch of high spots. You're a 30-year-old kid. Soon you'll be a 50-year-old kid, pretending you're hearing cheers when they ain't any. Dreaming and drinking your life away. Heroes in the real world live 24 hours a day, not just 2 hours in a game. The truth is, you never growed up. Grown-ups don't hang up on their friends.
Get away from the car.
And they don't hang up on their wives, and they don't hang up on life. Now that's the truth, and that's what you can't face.
It was this kind of energy of the fact that, like, Brick stayed a child. Most children tend to embody more feminine energy as children. And in many cultures, there's actually a masculine initiation, that it's not a natural progression. Like, women stepping into womanhood is kind of like nature sort of does that for them. You know, nature kind of initiates women into womanhood, basically, for their cycle. I mean, women kind of naturally grow into feminine adults. Society does screw that up totally, like that's a whole other discussion, but like that it's more natural, whereas there's a very strong belief in most cultures that males or masculine core beings need to be initiated from boyhood to manhood, usually with strong male role models. And it's implied, and it's probably very true, that Brick never stepped into his masculine energy. He never really stepped into manhood. He became a man. I mean, he clearly looks like a man in this film, but he never really got out of that boyhood immaturity and was really fully able to step into the man that he was capable of being, which can happen a lot, again, when you don't have strong male role models. A lot of times if you end up in situations like a glorified kind of career where, you know, you're put up on this pedestal and your ego is constantly being fed, but you don't get pushed into having a greater purpose, and you don't really get to fully become the person that you fully can be, because you're living in your ego all the time, which can very often lead to a lack of passion and purpose in life, and that can very often lead to wounded femininity in males. Now, Brick's wife Maggie is played by Elizabeth Taylor. There's so many references in this that she is a feminine core being, and I really do believe that she's feminine at her core.
Yes, indeed. This girl has life in her body. And that's no lie.
She does sometimes slip into a more masculine energy, strategic kind of move, like when she's trying to figure out how to impress Brick's family, try to get on the good side of the family because they don't know what's going to happen to the father, and not wanting to lose out on Brick's inheritance.
And leave the field to Gooper and that wife of his? No, sir. Let's face facts, baby. You're a drinker, and that takes money.
I don't want his money.
You ready to settle for 10-cent beer? Because that's just what Gooper will dole out to you when they freeze you out. They got a plan, baby.
You get the impression that she grew up very poor, so she's been trying to move up in life.
You can be young without money, but you can't be old without it.
She definitely has some strategic and somewhat manipulative tactics, which can lend itself to being more of a wounded masculine. It's not overwhelmingly so, because she feels so feminine at her core.
You make out fine. Your kind always does.
Oh, I'm more determined than you think. I'll win, all right.
Win what? What is the victory of a cat on a hot tin roof?
Just staying on it, I guess. Long as she can.
The problem is she's She's a feminine core woman who's desperate. Like, she's not happy in her situation. Femininity is life force energy. They make reference to it later on in the film, like this woman has life in her body, you know what I mean? And she's kind of telling them that she's pregnant, but we know she's not actually pregnant, but it's like she's got life in her. Like, feminine energy is life force energy. It's sexual energy. It's about, it doesn't have to involve sex, but it has to involve the pleasures of life. And she's now with a husband who she's very attracted to. She's very drawn to. She wants the pleasures in life.
Lean on me, baby. You've got a nice smell about you.
Her husband can't give that to her, and so she's kind of desperately trying to get that from him. So she's now chasing him. She's making the moves. They imply that she's basically like begging and pleading with him for sex every night.
We occupy the next room. The walls between aren't soundproof. We hear the nightly pleading and the nightly refusal.
Sister woman, not everybody makes as much noise about love as you do.
You know, you have two sort of wounded feminine characters, but the her going after him is more masculine energy. But it's not coming from a healthy place of like, I'm gonna take charge and take control of this. It's coming from like a very like desperate, needy place. So she's got a lot of sort of this like wounded masculine, wounded feminine stuff is going on in her reaction to him and what he's going through. And with all that wounding and her being so naturally feminine and him being so wounded feminine, they're really repelling. I mean, in many cases, he's just totally repulsed by her.
Living with somebody you love can be lonelier than living entirely alone. When the one you love doesn't love you. You can't even stand drinking out of the same glass, can you?
Would you like to live alone, Maggie?
No!
And I know, again, it's implied a little bit in the film that he might be homosexual, and I don't really know if that's the case or if it's not. It's just kind of implied, but I do get the impression that they had a pretty good sex life at one point. So it's not like he just didn't want a woman or anything. It was like they obviously had been attracted to each other at one point, but he's repulsed by her now because like feminine and feminine energies repel sexually. Same as masculine and masculine energies repel sexually. You need a feminine energy and a masculine energy in order to attract sexually. That's polarity. The thing is, this dynamic is so common in today's marriages, and it's people, like, I believe that wounded feminine energy is rampant in our society among men. It does exist among women as well, but I feel like there's so much of this wounded feminine energy in men. It's men who have had to suppress their own emotions, so they're suppressing their own inner feminine so that they're not really able to express that. So then they resent women when they express their feminine energy freely. So many men nowadays don't have like an actual passion and purpose in life, whether it be that they felt like they had one but it disappeared, or they had one that was just feeding their ego and not their soul, and when that dried up they just didn't know what to do or where to go, or some just haven't been initiated into that, into having an ambition and actually going out and finding themselves. And when the masculine doesn't have that, it's just, there's just no, they can't really function in life. I mean, you need the masculine needs a greater purpose in life. So when you have men that don't have that for whatever reason, and there's probably a million different reasons we could break down, and I think that's for another video, there's a million different reasons why that happens in males. Like, they either attract women who are usually in a very wounded place themselves, maybe they're in a wounded masculine, and that dynamic, my friends, you don't see it quite this much because Maggie is so feminine. But that dynamic of kind of like the passive sort of battered husband and like that sort of naggy, aggressive, controlling wife, that's a wounded feminine male and a wounded masculine female right there. That's two wounded energies that polarize together because they're opposite energies, but they're wounded and they got together. It's just so common nowadays, and that's why you get so many couples that are just staying together but they're not happy. And I could do a whole other video about polarity and those kind of polarities and things like that, but this is just such an example of that. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be that the husband was a pro athlete and had all this fame and glory and then he lost it. It may be that the husband never had a purpose, but he got married anyway and just feels kind of lost. Or maybe he's in a job that just doesn't feed his soul, and he's getting, you know, he's just, you know, earning a paycheck and just sort of going through the motions all the time. Or maybe he just, you know, lost his job at one point and just never got another one, and he just lost his purpose. And if he's married to a feminine cored woman, she's eventually going to be repelled by that, in the same way that when he gets into that real wounded feminine energy, he's going to be repelled by a feminine wife, even if she is fully in her femininity. He's also going to resent her a lot for being in such a healthy feminine energy. And probably, you know, wounded people can very often drag the other partner down with them, because polarity is so important when it comes to a relationship, that one person may feel like they need to shift into a different energy just to keep a partner to try to save their relationship. Now, that's not to say that it can't work in reverse, and you can't have, say, like your feminine cord partner who then shifts into a masculine, and so then the masculine cord male then ends up kind of shifting into a toxic femininity because of the feminine cord being like, it's not like it can't work in reverse, but in this particular situation, it appears that the male or the masculine cord partner that was the one who shifted and was going through the issues, and that was kind of like dragging the feminine cord being into this sort of toxic situation. It can totally work in reverse. I'm just using this film as an example of when it happens in this way. Yeah, I'll try to look for an example of a film that actually does it the other way, so we can kind of discuss that. So if you really want to see a great example of a shift in polarity, and because it's a film and because all of these movies are very like drastic, over-the-top examples, like most situations, polarity is not necessarily going to shift that instantly if two people are in a really destructive pattern for a long period of time. But you can see how quickly polarity can shift in the final scene. And if you haven't seen the movie, again, I encourage you to watch this film, like with all my other film breakdowns. I encourage you to like watch this video and then go watch the movie, even if you've seen it, so you can kind of pick up on some of the things that I've mentioned in this video. But in the final scene, and if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, I'm gonna mention the ending. Rick goes upstairs and he calls to Maggie.
Maggie?
Yes?
Come on up here.
Yes, sir.
And, you know, he literally is like, come up here. And her response is like, yes, sir. Like, I mean, it's got kind of a little bit of a hint of like dominant submission going on. Dominant submissive sexual activities tend to be manifestations of extreme masculine dominant and extreme feminine submissive. Not that that has to be gender necessarily, but those are the energies of it. She immediately slips into like, yes sir. Like she all of a sudden kind of submits to him. And if you notice that she gets very soft with him, and he gets very strong, and he gets very he's very present, he's very direct. Like he now has a direction, and he's like staring at her, and it's like he takes charge now. Like he steps into his masculine energy at the end of the film, and she can surrender and submit to him. So steamy. In real life, I mean, that shift can happen, like polarity shifts can happen instantly. However, if people have fallen into really deep patterns, and, you know, Rick obviously has a lot of addiction issues and things like that, I mean, it's going to take a lot of inner work on probably both of their parts. I mean, the patterns aren't going to just stop because he decides to take charge. But in that moment, they had that polarity. You notice like that seemed like that was the dynamic that they both became comfortable in. Like he was stepping into his masculine, which felt more like his true self, and she stepped into her feminine, which felt more like her true self. And that's when they came together. Again, you know, shifts like this, especially with somebody who was as wounded as he was, with as much traumas and difficulties, like, again, until he really finds his passion in life, and until he probably does a lot of work on guilt and shame that he has about his friendship and things like that. Like, this dynamic is not, I mean, they're not, I don't believe that after this film was over that they were just like, oh, let's live happily ever after, and now he's the man and she's the woman and everything's great. Like, there's more work that's gonna need to be done, but this is a really good example of, like, when the polarity shifts and people then shift into their natural energies, and it's just like, ooh, sparks fly. So I hope you enjoyed this film breakdown. I'm really glad that I found this film because it's such a great example of wounded feminine energy in men, which I think is really, really common in today's society, and it's just not something I feel like we talk about enough. And obviously in these old Hollywood film examples, it's over the top, it's dramatic, although to be honest, I do think there's probably a lot of people who could very much see themselves in either of these characters. But I feel like these over-the-top film examples are such a great way of people seeing the extreme versions of things, so then when they are actually going about their everyday life, they get to kind of see, it's easier for them to pick out the subtle nuances of these masculine and feminine energies within their everyday life. So I hope you enjoyed this film breakdown. If you have any films or TV shows you'd like me to talk about and break down for masculine and feminine energies, just leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. I love your suggestions. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and be sure you subscribe to my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.